So I want to continue the review of some basic microeconomic concepts. Again, looking at a situation of perfect competition, supply and demand for milk. We've got an equilibrium price and quantity, and we want to think about what happens if there is a price such that it's not equal to the market equilibrium price P1 star. So let's imagine we have a price P2. So what we want to do is to find the quantity of supply and demand. You take the price P2, you go over to the demand curve. Okay, so if we're looking at consumption, we always want to use the demand curve. So demand and consumers always thought about it in the same breath. At this price, we go over to the demand curve. There's the quantity demanded at price P2. Okay, you read the quantity off of the horizontal axis. At this same price, we've got a quantity supplied. So to get the supply, you take the price and you go over to the supply curve, go straight down. And the difference between these two is excess supply of milk. There's more milk that is being supplied than is being demanded by consumers. That will push the price down. Okay, simple supply and demand, but just a reminder. So if we have an excess demand, it will be just the opposite. Just do this quickly. There's the supply, there's the demand, there's the equilibrium price. If we had a price that was too low relative to the equilibrium, we would have quantity supplied of Q2 quantity demanded of Q5. As the price is lower than what the market says should be the case, it's lower than the equilibrium price, you have excess demand. That will push the price up until you reach the point where supply equal to demand. So the price is such that you've got a disequilibrium. There's this tendency in a market to push to an equilibrium price. Okay, so basic supply and demand, but it's a useful thing to remind you about how that works. Okay, so let's think about what happens in the case of a supply or demand curve shift. Okay, still this supply and the demand of milk. There's the quantity of milk. Here's the original supply. There's the original demand. The original equilibrium price. And let's say that we have a decrease in the supply. Now recall, with a decrease in supply, what we're talking about is at any given price, there will be less brought to the market. So that's a shift back in the supply curve. Okay, it's important that you keep that in mind. It's not a change in the quantity supplied, it's a change in the supply itself. Now that's just a term of art in economics. We use those two things very distinctly. This shift in the supply curve we call a decrease in the supply, or should, if you're being careful. Okay, now let's bring in this thought of excess supply and demand. At the original equilibrium price of P star 0, you have now more demand than you've got supply at the equilibrium price. Okay? So the decrease in supply will tend to increase the price in this market. Okay? That increase in the price will increase the supply from Q1 up to something may call it Q3, and will choke off some of the demand. So the market mechanism of dealing with the decrease in the supply is to increase the price. Now that clearly is going to have a negative impact on consumers and have impacts on producers as well. How you determine the consumer and producer supply effects is the subject of a different video. Finally, let's imagine you have the same situation. So instead of having a decrease in supply, let's have an increase in demand. Okay, you got supply, you've got demand, there's the equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, supply and the demand for milk, and now we have an increase in the demand. Now when I say increase in demand, that denotes a shift in the demand curve. At any price, you will be willing to demand more. Some fundamental difference in the demand. For example, increase in income of the consumer, maybe the increase in the price of a substitute good, so people switch their demand to milk. So all sorts of different reasons why that could take place. Bottom line is at the original price of P0 star, there is now an excess demand for milk. The supply is less than the demand. Again, to get the supply and demand, we go take that price, go over to the static unmoving supply curve, you go over to the new demand curve, you go down, and so what we have is that this excess demand for milk can be solved by an increase in the price up to P1. Okay, where you have more supply that's generated to meet the demand and a decrease in the demand because of the higher price. Now, one bit of terminology here it's important to get this distinction correct. So we initially had an increase in demand, okay, so a shift in the demand curve. As a consequence of that shift, we have had an increase in the price. That increase in the price will result in a fall in the quantity demanded using this new demand curve. So people get this confused sometimes. There's an increase in the quantity demanded, and then a change as the market forces start to work on the quantity demanded in this market that is a result of the price change. So one is a shift. So the increase in demand is a shift of the demand curve. The response by consumers to an increase in the price is a change in the quantity demanded. So important to make that distinction. You don't want to use increase in demand for both situations because they mean very different things. So there's a little bit of background or review of the functioning of a perfectly competitive market with market disequilibrium and shifts in the supply and the demand curve.